indie dyed kiwiat yarn for over 100 US dollars per ounce, sterling silver knitting needles for 120 US dollars per set. No thanks. Today I have other plans. I ordered the cheapest yarn, the cheapest knitting needles, and the cheapest tapestry needle I could find online to check if I could knit a hat for under 5 US dollars. The package arrived today, so let's take a look inside. So here is the yarn and here are the knitting needles I ordered. So I bought altogether 3 skeins for €1.77 each. That's around about 2 US dollars. The label says wool thread, and then here it comes, delicate and soft and intimate warmth. Now, isn't this juicy? So if in the future you should happen across a parental advisory in front of one of my tutorials, you certainly know why. Then it says first grade, whatever that is, perhaps touched for the very first time. And then Australian wool, goat, dog, sheep, we shall not know, but there is 30% anti-pilling fiber in it. Now, isn't this a fancy name for what is basically acrylic? And then there is 10% moisture regain, whatever that is. I mean, I possibly would have appreciated a yarn weight and a recommended needle size, but you know, since we are not knitting swatches anyway, who needs that? Well, setting the jokes aside, I do have to say that the color is actually kind of nice, a nice sand beige tone. And it's actually surprisingly soft. So it says it comes from Australia. Could be merino yarn, could be. Let's head over to my office to check whether that is actually true. As you can see, this burns quickly, but it also smells like burned hair. And if you look very closely, you might see little droplets forming at the end of some fibers. I can also crush the ashes. Now this here is some Regia 8-ply yarn that is also 70% sheep wool and 30% polyamide. And as you can see, it burns in a very similar way. Warning, never randomly burn fibers without doing your research first and of course observing the safety protocols. Either way, it's safe to assume that this is actually what it says it is. For 2 US dollars per 50 grams gain, I actually cannot complain. Now, how about the hollow annular needles? Whatever. Well, these stainless steel needles were just €1.06, so that's around about $1.20. And what I kind of like is that it even comes with a tapestry needle. The tapestry needle is already included. And if you take a very close look at these needles, you can see that the cables are actually coated wire. And the tips are actually very nice and sharp. And that is what attracted me to these needles to begin with, because who likes curly cables? And I mean, the ends are kind of peculiar, bent down as they are, but I own some Adi needles that have a similar end shape and they're actually quite nice. So I'm not gonna lie here, it actually looks quite promising. Enough of the preface. I am going to cast on a couple of stitches here because, as I said, I don't know the yarn weight, the recommended needle size or anything. So I need a little swatch here to check out this yarn, and I can share my first impressions of the quality of these needles and the yarn as I go. So I'm actually almost shocked. So I was expecting the worst, but these needles, they are nice. They're actually very nice. The tips, so I tried, when I looked online, I tried to find knitting needles that had a sharp tip and where you could see that on the pictures. Not always easy, but these here have a very nice tip. Goes through the knitting like butter. And they're also very, very smooth. So it's stainless steel, and if you've ever knitted with Chagu or Haya Haya or the Knit Pro Mindless needles, you might know that the surface actually almost has a kind of texture. And these here, they are very smooth to the point where they could be coated, but they aren't. I don't think they are. So very nice, and the yarn, nothing I could complain about. If you told me the skein wasn't $2 but maybe 5 or 6, and the needles $8 or $9, I wouldn't question that at all. So very, very nice. I mean, it's not cashmere or something like that, but very nice. And if you think about it, I paid $2 per skein of yarn and $1.20 for the knitting needles. That's a total of $5.20, and I can knit an entire hat with that, like from scratch, and I have all the materials I need to do that. That's nice. Now let's speed things up a little bit. As you can see, I already washed and blocked my swatch, and this is the result. So while I head back to the studio, I want you to comment right now what you think about this swatch. Is this a stitch definition you like, and do you like the yarn? Please comment below. I used the past 2 hours to start my little hat here and knit some stitches, and I think I can share my first impressions with you. I really have to say I almost love the knitting needles. Of course, I mean, those are fixed circulars, and those are always a little bit easier to manufacture than interchangeables, but they glide through the stitches like butter. The tips have the right kind of sharpness without being too sharp. The needles are slick, but not too slick, and they don't make any funny noises. And they're also very, very light. I mean, after all, they are annular hollow needles. But for $1.20 the pair, I would say they are above and beyond expectations. I mean, here on my channel, I reviewed knitting needles from major brands that were 10 or sometimes 15 times as expensive, that were not even half as good. So, you know, I would buy them again. So 10 out of 10 points, I would say. I mean, for the price. Now, when it comes to the yarn, I would say it's decent. Here, under this intense studio light that also bleach away all my wrinkles, the yarn reflects the light a little bit too much, and sheepwool doesn't do this. And the label said it had 30% anti-pilling fiber in it. So, plastic. And I would say, well, it's just a hunch. I'm not going to send this to the lab, but I would say, to me, it feels more like there was 40 or 50% acrylic in it. It's just a hunch, but that would be my verdict. But I will say, I mean, the stitch definition is quite decent. It doesn't feel entirely horrible, to the point I would actually call this nice and soft. And yeah, I mean, is it the best yarn I ever knitted with? Probably not. But if I think of these Super Saver, Bargain, Bundle, 500-gram acrylic skeins from hell that scream tribalactic charging from 3 miles away at the top of their lungs, well, this is also quite far away from that. So this pretty much feels like your well, run-of-the-mill sheep wool acrylic blend. But since the price is that low, I would actually say this yarn is also kind of exceeding expectations as well. Not by such a wide margin compared to the needles, but still very nice. It's 2 days later and I finished knitting my hat. It still lacks a pom-pom. I have this pom-pom here made from scrap yarn that I want to attach to it, but since this yarn here is not part of this video, I'm not going to do this right now. I have to say that this has been an almost humbling experience. Why? Because I thoroughly enjoyed knitting with these knitting needles, and the yarn has been quite decent as well. Even now wearing this hat, it's not itchy or scratchy. And you know, sometimes yarn, if there's too much acrylic in it, then you start sweating quite quickly and everything turns into a sauna, and none of that. And I mean, call it prejudice, or maybe it's based on many years of experience, but I was expecting the worst, and inwardly I thought this was going to be the angle of this video. You know, I bought cheap yarn and it has been horrible, when in fact the opposite was the case. Now you probably want to know where to buy this yarn and these needles, and the truth is that's kind of impossible for me to tell because it's a no-name product made in China, so it literally doesn't have a name you could search for. I bought this yarn on Temu. And I'm very, very hesitant to even add a link here to these products because not a week goes by, not a single week goes by where I get a very aggressive email from Temu asking for a collaboration. And I mean, I could have easily turned this video here into such a collaboration. It would be a very nice angle. It would be a very, well, insidious way to advertise for them, I guess. Yet I didn't. By buying this yarn and needles such as these, you support a system of exploit. Human exploit, exploiting the environment, and even to a degree the tax authorities. And ideally speaking, I would say, buy local products directly from local producers or at least local vendors. That has always been my credo. Saying things like that comes with its own problems. First of all, if the local vendor gets their supplies from a low-wage country as well, you are not really fixing any problems. You only pay an unnecessary middleman. Only 6 months ago, a US-based company wanted me to promote their knitting kits. Those were kind of monthly subscription boxes full of dead cheap made in China yarn and knitting needles at a premium price, and the only thing that was actually from the US were the people who put together these boxes. And you know, these needles here cost $1.20, and I bet you a lot of money that the average Chagu or higher knitting needle, which are also produced in China, could be sold for the exact same price or close to that. In fact, the chances are pretty high that the cables or the stainless steel for these needles come from the exact same supplier or wholesale seller. So the premium you pay goes to a US-based middleman, a fancier cotton bag, and maybe some marketing costs, but not necessarily a higher quality or less human or environmental exploits. Secondly, not everyone has the luxury to choose. If one has barely enough to pay rent and food, I think it's kind of brazen to tell them to buy only single origin yarn and ebony knitting needles. I mean, sure, we should all work towards a society where everyone, and not only a selected few, can afford basic luxuries and have a modest hobby such as knitting. The reality, however, is that this is becoming increasingly difficult for a lot of people. So I would argue that being frugal is no sin. It becomes a sin if you knowingly ignore a moral problem that is worse than your own and don't even make a minimum effort to educate yourself. If you buy a cheap yarn or cheap knitting needles from a low-wage country and companies that are known to exploit their employees, when you could afford a better option, and the only reason you do that is so you can save a little bit of money and you use that money to go on a second vacation this year. You buy a bigger TV set, you buy a second car or a better car. I think this is where the problems start. So when you go yarn shopping, I urge you to do your research. I urge you to look for local options, because if nobody supports these businesses, they will not be there in the future when you want something fancy, when you want something special, when you want something traditional, when you want someone to talk through your options, or simply you need something that is available to you because cross-border trade has become an issue. At the same time, just because it's cheap doesn't mean it's bad quality if you know what you are looking for. And I hope this video gave you some, well, food for thought. Anyway, let me know what you think about this whole issue. Comment below, and as always, happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day. And I really have to say, even wearing this hat all this time, it's still not itchy. Amazing.